Okay, access to data from regulatory authorities. I have borrowed some slides from, oh, now here it is again, Bill Gates making tricks. So, he went away. So, I have borrowed some slides from my PhD student, Anders Jørgensen. And what we did was that we applied to the European Medicines Agency 5 years ago a very simple request, namely trial protocols and trial reports of 2 anti-obesity drugs. We wanted to explore the robustness of the results, study selective reporting, and this was because the effect is quite small of anti-obesity drugs, and there are significant and substantial harms, and many of these drugs have been taken off the market because of these harms. But it was very difficult to get access to these data, although the regulation that is important here in the European Union specifies that any citizen of the Union and any natural or legal person and so on has a right of access to document of the institutions. Okay, that sounds good, but it didn't work that way. Also, it says that openness contributes to strengthening the principles of democracy in the European Union and also the legitimacy of its decisions. Now, we received a reply from the EMA's director, Thomas Lundgren, who said, "We regret to inform you that the documents you requested cannot be released because there are some exceptions to these wonderful rules. And the exception applies to the documents we requested. And why? Commercial interests." Okay. Now, we spent the next 3.5 years before we got access to the data, and we published all this in the British Medical Journal. So the delays on our part amounted to 11% of the first 3 years, and we awaited replies for 1,028 days, and they always came in at the last moment according to the deadline that the European Ombudsman had imposed on the EMA's director, Thomas Lundgren. So that was a pretty funny experience. Now, what were the main arguments? The European Medicines Agency was very worried about undermining protection of commercial interests, and competitors could use the documents for similar products, they said. We said that these study reports and protocols are based on well-known principles. There are no commercially sensitive information whatsoever in these documents. Furthermore, trials represent the last phase of a drug development program. So how could competitors use these documents for similar products that they were first going to invent and then study in rats and humans and so on? It's pretty far out, we thought. Now, since the EMA wouldn't talk to us really, we complained to the European Ombudsman. And he said that he could not see that access would specifically and actually undermine commercial interest, because that's part of EU regulations. You cannot just say there is a risk. You should be more specific than that. So this was an important point. And I must say the European Ombudsman is a fantastic person. He really saw our case as something of general interest. Now, what about the overriding public interest? Because you can get access, even though they are commercial interests, if you can say that is an overriding public interest. So this was our other argument. Now, the EMA said it's us who evaluates and monitors safety and efficacy of drugs, so no need for you guys in Cochrane to get access to anything. There is no overriding public interest, which they said. So we said that, come on, post-marketing surveillance could never have revealed that Vioxx kills people through heart attacks, as Teddy showed us, because many people die of heart attacks, so when this rate is raised, you wouldn't discover that. That's very likely. So this monitoring of safety is not very safe. Now, we also said that we had already noticed that there were different numbers in different reports from the EMA and from the FDA and from the published articles. So there surely was a need for some detective work here. And furthermore, and most importantly, we had a lot of evidence that selective outcome reporting can kill thousands of patients. So come on now, how can you say there isn't an overriding public interest when patients die by the tens of thousands because of all this commercial interest? So what did the Ombudsman say? He said, I don't take a definitive stance on whether there is an overriding public interest, because he already said that he didn't believe in the commercially sensitive information. So he never ruled on this particular issue. Now, there were some other interesting arguments. The EMA said it was an administrative burden to redact personal data that we are not allowed to see, and the documents would actually be worthless for us after they are having handled them. It's almost like the drug industry. That's how they argue. Now, what we said was, that's funny because we didn't have similar problems when we got access to a third anti-obesity drug at the Danish Medicines Agency. That worked well. Furthermore, the Ombudsman again helped us and said the only personal data is study authors and principal investigators, the name of those, which is pretty funny. But for example, in Germany, they are very anxious about revealing names of people. Whereas I think if people participate in a trial, they're accountable. Why can't we know their names? That's a bit funny, but that's how it is. So we would only need to redact some names, and that would be quick and easy. So after the EMA still didn't give way, and Thomas Lundgren, its director, went out in a lucrative consulting business for the drug industry after he had opposed us for 3 years. So there was some worry in the European Parliament about conflicts of interest at the European Medicines Agency. Now, after he didn't get anywhere, this ombudsman who worked with our case for years, he published a press release where he said EMA's refusal to grant access is maladministration. And the EMA just couldn't then deny any longer. So they gave in. And what are the implications of this? The EMA has now recently widened the access to trial protocols and clinical study reports, and other regulatory agencies should follow suit. We are now ahead of the FDA after many years of having been behind the FDA in revealing secrets. And the Cochrane collaboration supports free access to all data from all clinical trials, including the raw data, the individual patient data. And I have now many valuable contacts in European Parliament because of this. And I work on trying to create legislation there to make data sharing happen through the contacts I have, as guidelines and other voluntary agreements don't work. And there should be appropriate sanctions that hurt to hold those accountable who will still refuse to share their data. I have written a long report about this, which a European politician asked me to do, that I published last year. You can see below here. Now, we then do some further research at our center. Now we look at the antidepressant drugs on suicidality, hostility, and violence caused by antidepressant drugs. And many of you will know that the large companies have cheated with their data when reporting on suicidality in children and adolescents. They have called suicidality emotional lability. They have called them admission to hospital or lack of effect. I consider this outright fraud. So now we are studying whether these drugs are also dangerous in adults by getting access to individual patient data at the EMA. We know they are dangerous in children. They might also be dangerous in adults. We don't know yet. And we also study observer variation when people code harms. To our big surprise, there isn't a single observer variation study in the universe where people have studied what happens when a patient reports an adverse event. You have coding instruments. There must be huge variation in that, and also cheating, as you can see. So we need to study that. So we are embarking on this. Now, what is the experience from other drug regulators? The UK is like contacting MI5. It's completely closed, and it's anonymous. I even can't get a name who sent me an email. Oh, it's very weird. And their excuse was workload. Even when we restricted our request to virtually nothing, it was still workload. They couldn't do it. But then it helped when I reminded them that actually the UK, though they might not believe it, belongs to the European Union. So they should take care of our case with the EMA and the European Ombudsman. That helped, and then we got some documents. The Netherlands were more positive, but prolonged negotiations involving companies that, of course, routinely denied us access, and the case is still not settled. And unfortunately, adverse events will be redacted. So these documents will be worthless for us. And why is it that we can't be allowed to see that drugs harm patients? This is utterly unacceptable. But the regulators are very positive, but they are under restriction of their local law. Now in Denmark, we are also positive, but it took 2 years. The company protested, and all the narratives on adverse effects on an anti-obesity drug were redacted. So the data were useless for us. In Sweden, they are hugely positive. We can get access to everything, but unfortunately, the data are on paper. They take up 70 meters. You won't believe it, but it does. In a mountain cave, and it's very costly to retrieve it. So we have some kind of standoff there with our nice Swedish friends. So there are practical issues here. Now, the international calls for data sharing have come from a lot of good organizations, but they are always restricted to publicly funded research. And what I have debated in my paper, there is no difference between public research and industry-funded research. It's an artificial distinction. Also, the British House of Commons have said that society's obligations towards the patients who participate in trials and all other patients must take precedence over commercial interests. The public is always a partner contributing trial participants, infrastructure. Taxpayers contribute both to research and by paying for the drugs once they're on the market. And there is actually quite some understanding in the European Union that you cannot distinguish between industry trials and publicly funded trials. But there is a long way to go because there is immense lobbying in Brussels from the drug industry. Now, who owns the trial data? Respect for trial participants, they run a personal and unknown risk by participating in trials, so therefore they must be the owner of trial data and also the society. I've been told by a lawyer that you cannot own data, which is interesting, so we'll work with that. And research can only be a public good if the public can see the data. And it's of course an unacceptable double standard that trial participants, they share data about themselves with investigators and drug companies, and then these investigators and drug companies are unwilling to share those data with other people. In an ethical perspective, it just doesn't hold. So by sharing our research data, we could save billions of any currency every year, at the same time improve the health and longevity of the citizens because they would take less drugs when we find out how harmful they are. So the incentive for bias, cheating, and fraud would be reduced when we can check the raw data. And if we don't have a complete knowledge base, we would do a lot of redundant research. And we can't have informed consent when patients participate in trials, obviously, if we don't have all the data. So the ethical review committees, they are sleeping.
They should wake up. I have